At 14 minutes past 3 on the afternoon of July 9th, 1943, over the scorched farmland of southern Sicily, Captain Robert Hawkins felt his aircraft die beneath him. The P-38 Lightning shuddered violently as cannon shells from a Messerschmitt Bf 109 tore through the left engine nacelle, ripping metal and hydraulic lines into twisted fragments. Fire erupted instantly, orange flames streaming back across the wing's surface, fed by ruptured fuel lines and superheated oil. Black smoke billowed from the engine compartment, thick and acrid, obscuring his view of the damaged wing. Hawkins had been flying reconnaissance over German defensive positions near Gela, photographing troop concentrations and artillery emplacements for the Allied invasion force gathering offshore. The intelligence he carried in his aircraft's camera bay was critical, detailing the exact locations of 3 Panzer divisions and coastal gun batteries that could decimate landing craft during the amphibious assault planned for just 2 days hence. Now, at 8,000 feet above enemy territory, with his left engine consumed by fire and his aircraft bucking like a wounded animal, that intelligence meant nothing if he could not survive the next 5 minutes. The second burst from the Messerschmitt came 3 seconds later. Hawkins had already begun a defensive break to the right, trying to use his remaining engine to maintain airspeed and maneuverability, but the German pilot anticipated the move perfectly. 20mm cannon rounds walked across the P-38's left wing with devastating precision, punching through aluminum skin and wing spars with mechanical efficiency. The structural damage was catastrophic and immediate. The outer 6 feet of the wing, from the aileron hinge point to the wingtip, separated cleanly from the aircraft in a single violent motion. Hawkins watched through his canopy as the severed section tumbled away, spinning lazily through the afternoon sky like a discarded toy before disappearing into the haze below. The sudden asymmetry hit him like a physical blow, a sledgehammer strike that sent his head snapping against the side of the canopy. The Lightning rolled violently to the left, the intact right wing generating full lift while the shattered left side created nothing but drag and turbulence. Hawkins slammed the control yoke to the right with both hands, fighting the roll with every ounce of strength in his arms and shoulders. The muscles in his forearms burned with the effort. The aircraft was trying to invert, to flip onto its back and enter an uncontrollable spin that would end only when it impacted the earth at terminal velocity, burying itself in Sicilian soil at over 500 miles per hour. Robert Hawkins was 31 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned to fly crop dusters over cornfields before the war transformed his life. His father had been a mechanic, a quiet man who understood engines and physics with an intuitive clarity that never required formal education or textbooks. He could diagnose a failing tractor engine by sound alone, could calculate stress loads on barn beams by eye, could fix almost anything with basic tools and patient observation. Hawkins had inherited that understanding, that mechanical intuition that treated machines as living systems rather than collections of parts. He knew aircraft not as abstract assemblies of specifications and performance charts, but as dynamic organisms of forces and balances, systems that could be coaxed and negotiated with rather than simply commanded. He had logged over 2,000 flight hours before Pearl Harbor, most of them in underpowered civilian planes held together with baling wire and stubborn determination. He understood what happened when things broke in the air, because he had experienced failures dozens of times and survived by thinking faster than the aircraft to fall, by finding solutions in the narrow window between crisis and catastrophe. That experience was about to save his life, but only if he could apply principles that contradicted every instinct screaming in his brain, every procedure drilled into him during training, every conventional wisdom about how to fly a damaged aircraft. The P-38 Lightning was designed as a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter, its 2 Allison engines mounted on separate fuselage structures connected by a central nacelle that housed the cockpit, armament, and nose wheel. The design gave it exceptional speed and firepower, making it one of the most feared American fighters in the European and Pacific theaters. But it also created unique flight characteristics that became dangerous when systems failed. With both wings intact, the aircraft was stable and predictable, responsive to control inputs, and forgiving of pilot error. With one wing partially destroyed, it became a physics problem that defied conventional solutions and demanded improvisation. The intact right wing was still generating lift, trying to roll the aircraft left in response to the aerodynamic imbalance. The damaged left wing, now shortened and asymmetric, produced almost no useful lift but created enormous drag that acted like a brake on that side of the aircraft. The two engines, if both had been functional, could have provided differential thrust to counteract the asymmetry, the right engine pushing harder to balance the forces. But Hawkins had already shut down the burning left engine and activated the fire suppression system, knowing that an engine fire could spread to fuel tanks and cause an explosion. White foam sprayed across the wing from pressurized bottles, smothering some of the flames but leaving the engine useless as a power source. He was flying on one engine, with 1.5 wings, in an aircraft that was aerodynamically unbalanced and actively trying to kill him with every passing second. Hawkins reduced power on the right engine, a counterintuitive decision that went against every survival instinct and every lesson from flight training. Conventional doctrine said to maintain airspeed at all costs, to keep the aircraft flying fast enough to retain control authority and prevent a stall. Speed meant life. Speed meant control. But Hawkins understood that speed would only magnify the forces trying to roll him inverted, increasing the lift differential between the intact and damaged wings. Lower speed meant less lift differential, less rolling moment to fight against. It also meant less time before he stalled completely and fell from the sky like a stone, but that was a problem he would solve in sequence, one crisis at a time. First priority, stop the roll. Second priority, maintain controlled flight. Third priority, find a place to land. He eased the throttle back gradually, feeling the airspeed bleed off, watching the needle on the airspeed indicator drop from 280 knots toward 200, then 190. The rolling motion slowed perceptibly. The yoke in his hands, which had been vibrating with control surface flutter and fighting his inputs, steadied slightly. He was still losing altitude at an alarming rate, still descending through 7,000 feet with the Sicilian landscape growing larger beneath him with each passing second. But he was no longer in immediate danger of flipping inverted and spinning into the ground. The Messerschmitt made another pass, the German pilot clearly expecting the P-38 to fall out of the sky without further intervention or wasted ammunition. Hawkins saw the enemy fighter flash past his right side, close enough to see the black Balkenkreuz cross painted on his fuselage, close enough to see the pilot's leather helmet and goggles through the canopy. The Luftwaffe pilot waggled his wings once, twice, a gesture that could have been respect or mockery or simply acknowledgement of fellow aviators' impending death, before banking away sharply toward the north and disappearing into the afternoon haze. German pilots often allowed crippled aircraft to fall rather than waste precious ammunition on targets already doomed by damage and physics. Ammunition was scarce in 1943. Every round counted and rationed. Hawkins felt no gratitude for the mercy, no relief at the departure of his attacker. He was too focused on the immediate problem in front of him, the impossible equation of staying airborne long enough to reach friendly territory or at least survive the landing. The Allied front lines were approximately 20 miles to the south, marked by the sound of artillery fire that rolled across the landscape like distant thunder. His current descent rate, calculated by watching the altimeter unwind and mentally timing the rate of change, would put him on the ground in approximately 8 minutes. He would not make it to friendly lines. Not even close. The fire on the left wing had diminished to a flickering glow, the fuel supply exhausted, and the fire suppression foam doing its chemical work. Smoke still streamed behind the aircraft in a long black banner visible for miles, a signal to every German soldier and anti-aircraft crew in the region that a crippled enemy plane was overhead. But the immediate threat of catastrophic explosion had passed. The wing structure, though damaged, was holding together. Hawkins turned his attention to control surfaces, assessing what remained functional and what had been lost. His ailerons, the hinge panels on the trailing edges of the wings at control roll, were asymmetric now. The left aileron, attached to the shortened wing, had severely reduced effectiveness. The right aileron was intact but overpowering its damaged counterpart, creating more imbalance than control. He experimented with small, careful control inputs, feeling how the aircraft responded to each movement. A gentle right input produced a sluggish, delayed roll that felt mushy and uncertain. A left input was almost completely useless, the damaged wing unable to generate the necessary force. He would have to fly primarily with rudder and elevator, using the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces to steer and control pitch, treating the aircraft like a damaged bird learning to glide with one wing clipped. At 6,000 feet, passing through scattered clouds that obscured his view of the ground intermittently, Hawkins made the critical decision that would define the next 4 minutes of his life and determine whether he lived or died. He would not attempt to glide directly toward friendly territory. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. The descent rate was too steep, the distance too great, the damaged wing producing too much drag. A straight glide would put him down in the middle of enemy-held territory, miles from Allied lines, where he would be captured or killed and the intelligence film destroyed. Instead, he would perform a controlled spiral descent, a maneuver normally used by pilots to lose altitude quickly in a confined area, but adapted and modified to compensate for the aircraft's severe asymmetry. A spiral descent involved banking the aircraft into a turn and allowing it to descend in a tight, circular path, trading altitude for control and stability. By spiraling to the right, in the direction of the intact wing, he could use the natural roll tendency to his advantage rather than constantly fighting against it. The aircraft wanted to roll left because of the lift differential, but by establishing a right-hand spiral and maintaining a consistent bank angle, he could balance that tendency with the centrifugal forces generated by the turn itself. The physics were elegant in theory, but terrifying in practice. It was a dangerous gamble with no margin for error. Spiral descents could easily become graveyard spirals, uncontrollable rotations that increased in speed and tightness until the aircraft disintegrated from structural stress or the pilot blacked out from G-forces. But staying level was not an option anymore. Level flight was bleeding energy too quickly, and he would stall long before reaching the ground in any kind of survivable configuration. Hawkins rolled the P-38 into a gentle right bank, applying right rudder pressure to coordinate the turn and prevent skid. The aircraft responded sluggishly, reluctantly, the damaged wing creating turbulent airflow that disrupted the effectiveness of the tail surfaces. He felt the nose drop as gravity combined with the turning forces to increase his descent rate. The altimeter unwound faster now, the needle sweeping past 5,500 feet, then 5,000. He carefully adjusted the bank angle, increasing it by 5 degrees to tighten the spiral slightly and improve control. The airspeed stabilized at 160 knots, fast enough to maintain adequate control authority and prevent a stall, but slow enough to avoid overstressing the already damaged wing structure. The world outside his canopy began to rotate in a steady, hypnotic motion. Brown agricultural fields, scattered white farmhouses with red tile roofs, the silver glint of river winding through the landscape to the east, a dirt road cutting straight across the terrain. Everything spun in a slow clockwise rotation as he descended through the afternoon sky. He focused intently on the instrument panel, trusting the artificial horizon indicator and the altimeter more than his own sensory perceptions. Spatial disorientation was a constant danger in spiral descents, the inner ear's balance mechanism struggling to correctly interpret the combined sensations of turning and descending simultaneously. At 4,000 feet, Hawkins faced a new and immediate problem. The spiral descent was working exactly as he had hoped, keeping him aloft and under control, maintaining stable airspeed and preventing the catastrophic stall or roll that would kill him instantly. But the spiral was also carrying him in circles rather than toward any specific destination or landing site. He needed to find a place to land quickly, a stretch of reasonably flat ground long enough and wide enough to accommodate an emergency landing by a crippled fighter aircraft. The P-38 Lightning required at least 1,500 feet of prepared runway under normal conditions, with both engines functional and all control surfaces intact. With a damaged wing, severely asymmetric lift, and no guarantee whatsoever that the landing gear would extend properly or support the aircraft's weight, he would need at least twice that length, possibly more. He scanned the terrain below systematically during each rotation of the spiral, looking for roads, fields, cleared areas, anything that offered even a remote chance of survival. Most of the visible landscape was divided into small agricultural plots, vineyards with neat rows of grapevines, olive groves with ancient twisted trees, all of it separated by stone walls and irrigation ditches that would rip the landing gear off and flip the aircraft instantly. None of It was remotely suitable for landing a fighter plane. Then, at the eastern edge of the spiraling view during one rotation, he saw it, a long, straight dirt road running northeast to southwest, probably a supply route constructed or improved by German forces for moving equipment and troops. The road was empty at the moment, no vehicles visible in either direction, no obvious obstructions. It was narrow, perhaps 20 or 25 feet wide at most, but it was straight and appeared relatively flat for at least half a mile. It would have to do. He had no other options. Breaking out of the spiral descent required precise timing and careful coordination of all remaining control surfaces. Hawkins waited patiently, continuing the spiral through another complete rotation until the road came into perfect alignment with his aircraft heading. Then he reduced the bank angle gradually, applying opposite rudder to stop the turn, and simultaneously adjusted the elevator to prevent the nose from dropping too steeply. The P-38 leveled slowly, fighting him every inch of the way, the damaged wing protesting each control input with vibrations that shook the entire airframe. He was at 3,000 feet now, descending through increasing turbulence as the afternoon heat, rising from the sun-baked Sicilian ground, created invisible columns of rising air. He aligned the aircraft carefully with the road, using small, precise rudder corrections to maintain heading while the damaged wing tried constantly to pull him off course. The landing gear was his next major concern, a critical system that could determine whether he walked away from this landing or died in a fireball. He reached for the landing gear extension lever, knowing full well that lowering the wheels would increase drag significantly and further destabilize an already marginal flight condition. But landing without gear was simply not survivable in any scenario. The P-38's tricycle landing gear configuration meant the nose wheel would touch the ground first during the landing flare, followed immediately by the main gear struts located under each engine nacelle. With one engine destroyed and the left wing severely damaged, the left main gear might not extend at all, might be jammed by hydraulic failure or structural damage. Even if extended, it might not lock properly, might not support the aircraft's weight during landing, might collapse on touchdown, and send the aircraft cartwheeling across the road in an explosive tumble of torn metal and igniting fuel. Hawkins pulled the landing gear extension lever firmly aft, hearing the hydraulic system groan and protest audibly even over the wind noise and the sound of the remaining engine. The right main gear extended smoothly and quickly, 3 green indicator lights on the instrument panel, confirming locked and secure position. The nose gear dropped and locked within 2 seconds, its indicator also showing green. The left main gear hesitated, the hydraulic pressure clearly insufficient to overcome damaged lines, bent actuators, or warped gear bay doors. Hawkins watched the indicator light remain stubbornly dark for 3 long seconds, 4, 5. He grabbed the emergency gear extension handle, a red T-shaped lever located beside his seat, and began pumping it vigorously. The emergency system used compressed air stored in high-pressure bottles to force the landing gear down mechanically when hydraulics failed. After 5 hard pumps, muscles straining with the effort, the left gear indicator finally flickered yellow, then reluctantly turned green. But Hawkins did not trust that light. The indicator could be showing green because a microswitch had been triggered, but that did not guarantee the gear was actually locked or capable of bearing weight. The mechanism could be jammed in a partially extended position, ready to collapse catastrophically under the shock of touchdown. He would not know the truth until the moment of contact, and by then it would be far too late to do anything except brace for impact. At 1,000 feet above the ground, Hawkins reduced power to idle on the remaining right engine, letting it spool down to minimize the asymmetric thrust that would try to push the aircraft off course during the final approach. The engine note dropped from a roar to a whisper, and the aircraft's descent rate increased immediately and noticeably. The altimeter unwound steadily through 900 feet, 800, 700. The road filled his windscreen now, no longer a distant line, but a concrete reality rushing toward him. He could see details with perfect clarity. Deep ruts carved by heavy vehicle tires, patches of loose gravel scattered across the surface, a wooden fence running along the eastern edge, individual stones embedded in the packed dirt. He was approaching too fast, still carrying 140 knots with less than 500 feet of altitude remaining. He desperately needed to slow down, to bleed off airspeed before touchdown, But pulling the nose up aggressively to increase drag would also reduce his already marginal lift and could trigger an immediate stall. He had to balance the descent perfectly, using tiny adjustment of pitch and the last remnants of engine power to arrive at the landing threshold, carrying the minimum possible speed that would still keep him airborne. At 300 feet, with the ground rushing up impossibly fast, Hawkins fully committed to the landing. There was no going around, no second chance, no abort option remaining. He pulled the nose up slightly and smoothly, feeling the airspeed drop toward 110 knots, then 100. The stall warning horn began to blare in the cockpit, a shrill electronic scream that filled his headset and demanded his attention. He ignored it completely, focusing entirely on the sight picture through the windscreen and the feel of the controls in his hands. The aircraft was balanced on the knife edge of aerodynamic stall. The wings barely generated enough lift to support the weight, but he was also slowing rapidly to a speed that might be survivable on initial contact with the ground. The road rushed up to meet him, close enough now to see individual stones, to count fence posts, to read the future in the packed earth. He flared the aircraft at the last possible moment, pulling the nose up firmly to arrest the descent rate, feeling the tail drop and the main landing gear reach hungrily for the ground. The right main gear touched first with a jarring, violent impact that sent a shock wave through the entire airframe and snapped his head forward against the restraining straps. The nose gear touched a fraction of a second later, another impact that compressed the strut fully and bounced slightly. Then the left main gear made contact with the road surface, and Hawkins immediately felt it begin to collapse under the load. The left side of the aircraft dropped suddenly and sickeningly, the engine nacelle slamming into the road surface with a grinding, metallic screech of torn aluminum and crushed components. Sparks erupted instantly from the contact point, a spectacular shower of orange and white that sprayed behind the aircraft like a comet's tail, visible even in the bright afternoon sunlight. Hawkins fought the controls desperately, tried with every remaining ounce of strength to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the narrow road, but the asymmetric drag was overwhelming and impossible to counter. The P-38 began to slew left, the nose swinging inexorably toward the wooden fence that bordered the road. He stood with all his weight on the right rudder pedal, his leg trembling with maximum effort, using every pound of pressure his body could generate, and simultaneously chopped the throttle on the right engine to zero thrust. The sudden complete loss of thrust helped slightly, reducing the yawing moment that was pulling him off course. The aircraft straightened marginally, still grinding and scraping along the road on two wheels, and one collapsed gear leg trailing sparks and debris. The airspeed indicator dropped rapidly through 60 knots, 50, 40. The wooden fence was only 30 feet away now, approaching fast on the left side, close enough to see the weathered gray wood and rusted nails. Hawkins pulled the mixture control on the right engine to idle cutoff, completely killing the engine and stopping all fuel flow. The three-bladed propeller windmilled briefly in the airstream, then coasted to complete stop. The aircraft was simply coasting now, rolling forward on momentum and friction alone, gradually bleeding energy with each passing second. At 20 knots, barely faster than a running man, the P-38 veered sharply left one final time as the damaged wing dipped low enough to catch the ground. The wingtip plowed into the dirt road surface, digging a deep furrow and acting like an anchor that pivoted the entire aircraft violently 90 degrees to the left. The fuselage swung around in a violent, uncontrolled arc, the tail section whipping past a wooden fence with only inches of clearance. Then, with a final shudder and a groaning protest of tortured, overstressed metal, the aircraft came to a complete rest. Silence fell suddenly and absolutely, shocking in its completeness. No engine noise, no wind rush, no warning horns, no impact sounds. Just silence and stillness and the smell of hot metal and disturbed earth. Hawkins sat motionless in the cockpit, hands still gripping the control yoke in a white-knuckled death grip, his heart hammering violently against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He was alive. Against every odd, against all reasonable expectation, he was alive. The aircraft was comprehensively wrecked, the left side crushed and destroyed, the wing torn away. The landing gear collapsed, but he was alive and essentially uninjured. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking uncontrollably, tremors running through his fingers and wrists that he could not stop. Hawkins unstrapped from his parachute harness and safety belts with fumbling fingers, pushed open the canopy with both hands, and felt warm Sicilian air rush into the cockpit. The air carried the smell of disturbed dirt, scorched metal, burned oil, and something else he could not immediately identify. He climbed carefully out onto the intact right wing, moving slowly on shaking legs, then dropped heavily to the ground. His knees nearly buckled when his boots hit the earth. He walked away from the wreckage on unsteady legs, putting distance between himself and the destroyed aircraft, half expecting it to explode despite the dead engines and empty fuel lines. His mind was already cataloging and analyzing the damage, reviewing the sequence of failures and decisions that had brought him to this impossible moment of survival. The camera bay, he suddenly remembered with a jolt of adrenaline. The intelligence. He turned back toward the wreck and saw that the central nacelle, which housed the cameras and film storage, appeared largely intact despite the violence of the landing. The shock-mounted film canisters, designed specifically to survive rough landings and crashes, had likely protected their contents. That meant the mission was not a complete failure. He had survived, and more importantly, he had brought back the critical intelligence that would save Allied lives during the invasion. That realization steadied him, gave him purpose and focus beyond simple survival. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, as the sun began to lower toward the western horizon, an American infantry patrol found Hawkins walking south along the dirt road, still carrying the precious film canisters in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The soldiers, dusty and tired from days of combat, stared in complete disbelief at the wrecked P-38 Lightning resting beside the road, at the missing wing section and collapsed landing gear, and the long scar of torn metal and disturbed earth that marked the violent landing path. They asked Hawkins repeatedly how he had possibly survived such catastrophic damage, how he had managed to fly and land an aircraft that looked like it should have fallen from the sky in pieces. Hawkins did not have a complete answer that satisfied them. He tried to explain the spiral descent technique, the physics of asymmetric lift, and how it could be managed rather than fought, the critical decision to land with partial control rather than bail out and lose the intelligence film. The soldiers nodded as though they understood his technical explanations, but Hawkins could see clearly in their eyes that they did not truly comprehend. They saw a miracle, an impossible survival against overwhelming odds. He saw a problem that had been solved through applied knowledge, desperate improvisation, and a substantial amount of pure luck. The intelligence film reached Allied headquarters by nightfall, rushed south by motorcycle courier. Photo interpreters worked through the night analyzing the images under bright lights, marking enemy positions on large tactical maps with colored pencils, and measuring distances with precision tools. The information confirmed existing suspicions about German defensive preparations and, more critically, revealed significant gaps in the coastal defenses that could be exploited during the amphibious assault. The photographs showed that several supposedly fortified beach sections were actually only lightly defended, protected more by reputation than by actual gun emplacements. 2 days later, on July 11, 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the massive invasion of Sicily involving over 160,000 troops transported in nearly 3,000 ships and landing craft. The landing craft approached beaches where German gun positions had been precisely pre-targeted by naval artillery and tactical airstrikes, guided by the intelligence that Hawkins had risked everything to bring back. Allied casualties, while still significant, were substantially lower than military planners had grimly predicted. The invasion succeeded in establishing a secure beachhead. In the official military reports filed after the operation, Hawkins's reconnaissance mission was noted simply as successful. The pilot formally commended for bringing back critical intelligence despite encountering enemy action. The landing itself, the seemingly impossible feat of flying and landing a catastrophically crippled aircraft with half a wing missing, was described in a single understated sentence. Pilots successfully recovered aircraft following severe combat damage and enemy action. The story might have ended there, forgotten and buried in the vast archives of wartime missions and countless acts of unrecorded heroism, except that Robert Hawkins wrote an extraordinarily detailed technical report of the entire incident. He documented every decision in sequence, every control input and its effect, every calculation and estimation that had kept him alive during those desperate minutes. He included careful sketches of the damaged wing structure, detailed diagrams of the spiral descent flight path, and extensive technical notes on how asymmetric thrust and lift could be managed and exploited in extreme emergency situations. The report ran to 17 pages of single-spaced typewritten text. It was filed with the Fighter Command Training Division, where it was read with great interest by instructors specifically tasked with teaching new pilots how to survive combat damage in emergency situations. Within 6 weeks, the spiral descent technique and the principles of asymmetric flight management were formally incorporated into emergency procedures training curriculum at multiple fighter training bases. Pilots learned through Hawkins' experience that a severely damaged aircraft could sometimes be successfully flown by working with its injuries and limitations rather than fighting against them, by using unconventional maneuvers that turn apparent liabilities into manageable assets. Over the following 18 months of continued war, at least 7 other Allied pilots successfully landed aircraft with catastrophic wing damage, using variations and adaptations of the technique that Hawkins had pioneered over Sicily. A P-47 Thunderbolt pilot operating over France brought down his fighter with nearly 3 feet of right wing missing after collision with German aircraft, spiraling into a farm field, and walking away with only minor injuries and a sprained ankle. A B-17 Flying Fortress co-pilot over Germany nursed his massive bomber with a completely shattered horizontal stabilizer and minimal elevator control back across the English Channel to an emergency landing in England using careful asymmetric power management and coordinated rudder inputs exactly as Hawkins had described. Each incident reinforced and validated the fundamental lesson. Aircraft could survive and be successfully landed after damage that appeared absolutely fatal if the pilot understood the underlying physics thoroughly and refused to surrender to panic or conventional thinking. The survival rate for Allied pilots attempting to fly severely damaged aircraft increased measurably and significantly. Lives were saved because one man had refused to bail out over enemy territory and had instead turned his crippled aircraft into an impromptu laboratory for testing the absolute limits of aerodynamic possibility. Robert Hawkins flew 63 more combat missions before the end of the war in Europe, each one adding to his experience and deepening his understanding of aircraft and combat. He was promoted to Major, formally awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for Valor and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and eventually assigned to a stateside training command where he spent the final year of the war teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. He never forgot those 4 desperate minutes over Sicily, the spiral descent through smoke and fire and fear, the grinding, sparking impact of the emergency landing. In quiet moments throughout the rest of his life, he replayed the sequence in his mind with perfect clarity, analyzing what he could have done differently, what small changes in technique or timing might have improved the outcome or reduced the risk. He concluded each time, after careful mental review, that luck had been as much a deciding factor as skill or knowledge. The wing structure could have failed completely at any moment. The landing gear could have collapsed earlier or not extended at all. The road could have been blocked by vehicles or obstacles, or could have been too short, or simply might not have been there when he desperately needed it. Survival, he came to believe deeply, was always a complex combination of knowledge, quick decision-making, and the fundamentally unknowable variables of chance and fate. In the decades after the war ended, Hawkins rarely spoke publicly about his combat experiences or the landing in Sicily. He returned quietly to Iowa, bought a small municipal airfield with his savings and veteran benefits, and spent his remaining years peacefully teaching civilian pilots and meticulously restoring vintage aircraft in a large hangar. When occasional visitors or aviation enthusiasts asked about the beautifully restored P-38 Lightning hanging prominently in his hangar, painted precisely in his wartime markings and squadron colors, he would tell the story briefly and without unnecessary drama or embellishment. Just the essential facts: the reconnaissance mission, the combat damage, the spiral descent, the emergency landing, the intelligence delivered. He never once called himself a hero or sought recognition. Heroes, he believed firmly, were the thousands of men who had not come back from the war, whose luck or skill or fate had run out somewhere over Europe or the Pacific, whose names were carved on memorials. He had simply been a pilot who solved an urgent problem under extreme pressure, using whatever tools and knowledge were available to him in that critical moment. That was all. That was enough. Robert Hawkins died peacefully in 1998, at the age of 86, surrounded by family. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his distinguished military service and his significant contributions to aviation training, but did not include details about the emergency landing in Sicily. The full story survived primarily in military training archives and in the collective memory of pilots who had learned from his documented example and applied his techniques. Today, more than 70 years later, the spiral descent technique for managing asymmetric flight is still taught in advanced pilot training programs worldwide, a standard emergency procedure for the unlikely but possible event of catastrophic structural damage. The method works reliably because it acknowledges physical reality rather than fighting against it, using the aircraft's own momentum and the immutable laws of physics to create a controlled descent where conventional techniques would certainly fail. It works because one pilot, on a summer afternoon over Sicily in 1943, refused to accept that a burning plane with half a wing could not possibly be landed safely. And in that refusal, in that stubborn, determined application of knowledge and nerve under impossible circumstances, he permanently changed what was considered possible and saved not only his own life, but the lives of countless pilots who would follow in later years, flying into danger with the confidence that even the seemingly impossible could be survived if approached with clarity, courage, and understanding.